What's up, everybody? It's Eric from Trimmed and Burning. We are back in our book Bible study where we're going book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and breaking everything down. And we're already in the ninth book of the Bible as far as how it's laid out from Genesis all the way through Revelation. We're in the ninth book of First Samuel. And we even learned that it's actually the scroll of Samuel has been split into the first and second Samuel, just like Kings and Chronicles will be to follow it. But that's where we're at. We're now in the books of history. So we did the books of Moses, and then now we're in the books of history. And if you understand the books of Moses, the five first books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, along with these history books, Joshua through Esther, you are going to understand the entire, pretty much, history of the Jews before they came. You're going to learn the history of the Jews before Jesus actually came as a baby in human form for 30 years. Although we're learning here that Jesus Christ was actually here pre-incarnate the whole time in the Old Testament. He's been popping up. The gospel message has been popping up because, no surprise, this is not God's plan B. The gospel was always the plan. It was plan A, and it's always been. So that's what we're seeing even in the Old Testament, which is cool because you can actually walk into a Jewish synagogue and go through what they use, which they only use the Tanakh, only the Old Testament. They won't touch Matthew through Revelation. And you can go through and read these, what we're reading right now, with them, and say, well, here's another reference to the gospel, like we've been seeing with the bread and the wine and the sacrifice. We're seeing the gospel message through and through here. But our whole point of this is to study that. The point of this is to figure out that God had a plan for us, that he's telling us one story. Although there's a library with 66 books, he's telling us one story, and it's always been the gospel. And when we're learning the history right on through here, and which even brings us up to modern day, Israel is back again, which Ezekiel talked about. And Israel's a nation, and that nation of Israel is exactly this nation right here. Their bloodline goes right back to this book. That's why they're still around, and that's what's going on right now. You can even see what's going on with the Canaanites are still there technically, and they're still warring with the Israelites. That's why all the nations want to get rid of Israel. It's basically the Canaanites. It's basically what you're seeing in the Old Testament because we're learning that these motifs continue around over and over again, and they continue on. So whatever's happening in our world today has happened in the Bible before, which is great because you reference this book, you can find some answers in there on how to proceed with things. Doesn't mean we're perfect, but it means that if we follow God's plan and God's word, we can live a more perfect life, which is what our goal should be. So we're going to jump right into a quick First Samuel recap, very quick, because we have some pretty good chapters in here that are a little bit longer. But I just want to kind of recap how we started in First Samuel. So it was the times of the judges we were in, right, where God's just raising up leaders here and there. They have no king like the other nations. And we learned about Samuel was born. His mother Hannah prayed in the beginning. He ended up becoming born. We learned about the contrast in Israel at this moment. Eli was the judge. He had two evil sons, Hophni and Phinehas. They were stealing the offering, doing a lot of sinful things, and the people knew about it, and Eli just kind of would tell them to knock it off but wouldn't really do anything, kind of like weak parenting, and also a weak boss because he's not only their parent, he's their boss because they're kind of like assistant pastors, I said. They're priests with Eli, and they were just doing sinful things in God's house, which they had nobody should be doing anything sinful in God's house. Nobody should be doing anything sinful in general. But when you're a leader, you definitely should not be doing these kinds of things. And they're always contrasted here in this book with Samuel. Samuel's a young boy in the first couple chapters. The ancient Hebrews believed he was maybe around 12 years old. We don't know, but he was a younger boy, we believe. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, we see he's woken up in the middle of the night, we believe, by Jesus Christ pre-incarnate, right? Because he's always been there. He's God. He always exists throughout this. And God speaks with an audible voice, and he's standing there at his bed, right? And he gave Samuel a prophecy that he gave to a godly man in the chapter before to let Eli know that his house was going to be judged, his household, because of the evil that had been going on, and Eli didn't really stop it, right? So we're seeing right now Israel's in turmoil again, just like they have always been in the book of Judges. Every time God raises them up, they get back into sin, idolatry, meaning they follow the other gods of the other nations. They become worldly, no different than what we can do sometimes, right? You can look at our lives during the week, and we're doing worldly things, focused on worldly idols, things that take our minds other than God. That's what the Israelites were doing, but they completely had turned from Yahweh in a lot of these instances. And even when they were, following Yahweh, so to speak, they were living a very sinful life, like we see with Hophni and Phinehas in this chapter, in this book, 1 Samuel. So it went on to 1 Samuel 4. We saw the prophecy in action, where Eli's sons were actually killed in a battle with the Philistines. He called, the Ark of they called the Ark of the Covenant out. They used the Ark of the Covenant as somewhat of a good luck charm. But God, doesn't allow that. That's not how God works. You can't just kind of wish God you can't talk him into things and negotiate him into things. It has to be God's will. And they used it improperly. The Philistines took it. Things got bad. And when Eli heard the news, he fell off his chair, broke his neck, and he ended up dying. So not only did his 2 sons die, he died as well. And then it went right into how the Philistines were cursed because they had the Ark of the Covenant. They shouldn't be touching God's stuff, right? And have it in a land of Gentiles, in the temple of Dagon, which was one of the other spirit gods that the Philistines worshipped. And we learned that the Dagon statue fell over, and it cracked, and the head broke off, and its hands. And Yahweh was showing his power, that he was stronger than Dagon, that they shouldn't mistake them being able to steal the Ark of the Covenant for Yahweh's weakness, right? That was just the Israelites' flaw, but God is not going to be stopped by the Philistines because they got his Ark of the Covenant. And they kind of use it as a trophy, but God starts cursing them. We found out they were passing the Ark of the Covenant all the way around their 5 city-states in Philistia, which is where the Philistines are from. It's southwest Israel now, right on the coast there. They were seafaring people right on the water there. And we're going to pretty much see from Judges even into 1 Samuel here, the Philistines are a very key enemy of Israel. But the Philistines finally got wise enough after 7 months. It was a while. And they ended up, getting rid of the ark with these golden mice and these golden bulges. And they sent it away with these 2 cows. And Yahweh showed that he was the one cursing them. He confirmed it. And the Ark of the Covenant went back to Israel. Praise the Lord, right? Although Israel didn't really do the right thing. They looked in it. They broke the rules that God had given them. And because they knew better, they were killed for that. 70 men died, where you don't see that really happen in Philistia. But that's because they didn't know better. God's kind of showing us here that, the more you know, the more you're required to uphold. And the Israelites knew better. They had God's law. They didn't follow it. And even they were killed there. So we learned that they started to turn back. Samuel comes back into the picture here. Samuel's now going to be the last judge. He's also going to be the first of the line of prophets we're going to see here in the kingdom. And we see this pattern again. Samuel is just telling them to do, and the Israelites are doing things they've done even in the past in the book of Judges. They're going to smash their idols. They had idols to the other gods. They're going to smash them, which is showing that they had an outward repentance along with their inward, right? You can say you're sorry, but when you're sorry, you should actually see some action come out of it. And the Israelites did actually, it seems they were sorry. They actually got rid of the idols, and they dedicated themselves to Yahweh, and they followed Samuel's instruction. And then we got to 1 Samuel 8. We're getting closer to being caught up where we're at now. Then we found out Samuel had 2 sons that were sinful, and so no different than Eli, really. And the people knew that Samuel now was getting old, so we're only 8 chapters in, and Samuel was born at the end of the first chapter, I believe, and now we're 8 chapters in, and now he's an old man. And they're basically like, Samuel, you're an old man, you're going to be gone soon, and we don't want your 2 sons to lead us because they're evil. And the elders of Israel were right for doing this, we found out, but where they were incorrect was they said they wanted a king instead. Rather than letting God raise up a judge and the Lord be their king, like he was always supposed to be, Jesus is always supposed to be the king, they instead took it into their own hands, asked for a king. Samuel's upset. God told him, they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. And God says, I'll give them what they want. And then Samuel gave a prophecy of how terrible it was going to be, how the king of Israel is going to be like the other ones. He's going to take their best of their harvest and their women and their workers and all these things, and it just wasn't going to be good, but Israel goes through with it anyway. So in chapter 9 then, we found out how Saul, who's from the tribe of Benjamin, is going to be king. We found out it was just some coincidental, quote-unquote coincidental. We know there's no such thing as coincidence, right, in the Bible and in our lives. Everything's ordained by God. It looks like a coincidental incident where Saul and his father had lost donkeys. He's going to look for these lost donkeys. Just so happens that Samuel's on tour in town. His servant knows about him. Saul's father's servant, knows about Samuel and says we should go ask him where the donkeys are. Rather than asking for spiritual wisdom, they're worried about earthly goods, right? Just kind of like how you can see some people's prayers, even if we're not careful, can be about worldly things and not always spiritual things. So you got to be careful. We see that there. Everything was set up. God had ordained it. There was a feast there with a special part of the feast going to Saul. God had already set this banquet up. It was a pretty miraculous thing. It looked like a coincidence, but it's never a coincidence. When things look like a coincidence, like and basically there's actually a term for the word absurd. If something's absurd, it means it should be statistically impossible to happen, but it did happen. So it was an absurd reality, but God ordained it. So things that seem impossible are not. And we learn about there that Saul was going to be king, and Samuel was told by the Lord before Saul even showed up. And then in chapter 10, we learned about how he was privately made king of Israel, and then he was publicly made king, but he still had some critics, right? We learned about how he had critics who didn't want to be king, and he acted wise here. We see that he was very modest. Saul started out very modest. He was hiding among the luggage. He didn't want to be announced king publicly, and he didn't attack his enemies and his foes that stood up against him. So he showed wisdom here, and he showed that he was modest, which was really great to see from him. But we know shortly after it doesn't go well. We're going to get into the night. We're going to see him kind of fall apart already. We're not much further ahead. And then chapter 11, we saw that Saul was kind of an event happened. God allowed this event to happen with Nahash. That they were all surrounded, and they ended up defeating them. It established Saul as a leader. They kind of renew the kingdom, where Samuel basically presents Saul to the nation, and now they're cheering and excited because he just won a battle. So he kind of earned his stripes, kind of. And now Saul was going to be a king, and this event led him to be a leader, and it looks good for the people here. And then we moved on to a farewell speech from Samuel. Samuel now is going to slip out of the leadership role completely, and he's basically going to hand it over to the King Saul, although Samuel's going to be there still. He's still going to be giving words of advice because that's what prophets are going to do. Prophets give a word from the Lord to the kings on how to act, and the king decides how to act. But Samuel gives a speech very similar to Moses in Deuteronomy. At the end of Deuteronomy, says, follow the Lord's commandments, you're going to be blessed. If you don't follow his commandments, it's going to be bad. But the good news is when you break God's commandments and you repent, he's going to forgive you. Gave that whole spiel. God sent, used natural storm here to show that it was true, to kind of show his power here. But Samuel's kind of here saying, you know what, Saul's your leader now. I don't want to be associated with this guy. He will be the leader, and he'll be responsible for everything moving forward. And that's how chapter 12 ended. And then now that gets us to tonight, where we're going to be at in chapter 13. If you're online, you can comment, you can ask questions, you can participate, just like if you're in the room with all of us here. So if you have any questions about the first 12 chapters or how we got here, you can ask questions online. Phil will relay it. And anybody in here, if there's any comments or questions based on the first 12 chapters, go ahead and raise your hand. Yeah, Jason.
One quick little detail that caught my attention. I wasn't here last week, and I don't know if you guys covered this or not, but one glimmer of hope we have for Samuel actually learning from his predecessor. We know that Samuel's sons were shown to be corrupt. And if you look at 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 2, it shows, and now behold, the king walketh before you, and I am old and gray-headed, and behold, my sons are with you. So his sons are now among the people. They're not in a position of authority anymore, which means that there may very well have been some sort of discipline, and we don't see the same pattern repeated from Eli's sons.
Amen. That's awesome. So Jason's pointing out right there, you see Samuel break the cycle, right? So just because it's a motif of, a pastor or a priest or judge, with sinful sons, you see there is a difference here. So Eli was cursed. He died and his sons died because Eli did nothing about this. Whereas, you could say Samuel fired them, basically. Although they were his sons, they got fired. It says they are among the people in some translations. They are with the people, meaning they were just like a common folk, common citizen. Imagine, a pastor of a church getting fired and now being among the congregation, right? They were removed from power because of the sin they had. So that's a great notice right there by Jason. And just to show that, and that's why Samuel, you'll see, continue on. Eli died, Samuel does not. Samuel's still wise and follows God. So you can see there's some godliness in there because really you're only responsible for your own actions. So Samuel's sons were sinful. That wasn't on Samuel, but how Samuel reacted and responded to that was important because Samuel was the leader of the nation that God rose up at that time, and he did the right thing there, which is why Saul takes over and his sons were now put out among the crowd as common folk. So it really shows his honorable godliness there, which is great. Great find, Jason. Anybody else? All right, awesome. I think we're good. So we're going to go ahead and jump in, continue on as we've been doing, reading verse by verse. We're going to start with chapter 13, and we're just going to go ahead with the first 7 verses. What we'll do is we'll read chunks at a time, and kind of analyze it, break it down just as we read it, as the Lord speaks, and go from there. So let's start out with the first 7 verses. Saul fights the Philistines. Verse 1. Saul lived for 1 year and then became king. And when he had reigned for 2 years over Israel, Saul chose 3,000 men of Israel. 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. The rest of the people he sent home, every man to his tent. Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard of it. And Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become a stench to the Philistines. And the people were called out to join Saul at Gilgal. And the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen and troops, like the sand on the seashore in multitude. They came up and encamped in Michmash, to the east of Bethaven. When the men of Israel saw that they were in trouble, for the people were hard pressed, the people hid themselves in caves, and in holes, and in rocks, and in tombs, and in cisterns. And some Hebrews crossed the fords of the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul was still at Gilgal, and all the people followed him, trembling. So let's just stop right there, the first 7 verses. Let's go ahead and break down the intro to this chapter. So you can see here, the Philistines, remember, they had the Israelites subject to them. They were subjugated to them, and they were oppressing them. And we're going to see some things shift here. So at first, you're going to see some weird thing in the first verse. Some translations are going to say something like he was 30 years old, and for the next, I don't know, it says 42 years or something like that. This one says lived for 1 year and then became king when he reigned for 2 years over Israel. That's from the ESV. The Hebrew doesn't have those exact ages like 30 and 42 like the other ones do, but we do believe Saul was around 30 years old when he started his reign, which is interesting because Jesus was, 30 years old when he started his public ministry, right? So some similarities there. And it says he reigned for 2 years over Israel. We believe he reigned about 42 years on how history shows. But it was just saying here that he was probably around 30 years old, and it's going to start to go into his army. So now he had 3,000 men from Israel that he chose. 2,000 were with him at Michmash, the hill country of Bethel, and then 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. Remember, that's where he's from. That's where the whole event at the end of Judges happened. And that's kind of going to be the headquarters there for Saul and his family. But he's at Michmash here. And which is really cool is we see Jonathan show up. So Jonathan, we will learn, is Saul's son. So Saul's son is a part of this. And we're going to see Jonathan shows a lot of godliness. He's one of the better characters of the Bible, has a lot of good going on about him. So we're going to see him pop in here in part of the story. So 1/3 are with Jonathan the son, 2/3 are with Saul, the rest went home. Then it says that Jonathan, his son, defeated the garrison of the Philistines that was at Geba, and a lot of people believe that Geba there is Gibeah. It could be another translation for it, and that the Philistines heard of it. So basically, Jonathan shows a bold move here. He defeats a garrison of the Philistines, and this kind of weakens the Philistines. It doesn't win the war, but it kind of sets them back a little bit. Kind of a little bit of a punch in the nose of the Philistines to kind of, wake them up. And it says that the Philistines heard of it. So the news traveled, and the Philistines were aware of what Jonathan had done. Then it says here that Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, so that's some kind of an announcement. He wanted to announce, saying, "Let the Hebrews hear." And all Israel heard it said that Saul had defeated the garrison of the Philistines, which is really interesting, right? Because we just read that Jonathan defeated the garrison of the Philistines. And we could ask ourselves, is he just trying to say is Saul trying to say, I'm king of Israel, so it's on my name, kind of like, my signature approval? And we know that actually happens a lot, like even in the United States, politicians or leaders, and even in organizations will get credit and they'll get a picture in the newspaper, but it might have been somebody else's work that was done, right? And it'll say, this person did this, and really there's some people behind the scenes. So it might have been some bureaucracy at play here, or it could be worse, which it might be worse, I think, where Saul wanted to take credit for this, and we're going to start to see maybe Saul's pride creep in here, where this good thing happens. And honestly, I'm going to tell you, when you see this in organizations, when people steal ideas, this is everywhere, by the way, it's all over the world. When people steal somebody's idea, somebody came up with a really good idea, this employee did it, and they steal this idea, and all of a sudden they're in the newspaper, that's pride. So that's exactly what's happening with a lot of the companies that you see in the newspapers, where some people, and some of the times the leaders really do that stuff, but we know there are workers that come up with plans, do legwork, and then there's PR pictures, with all that kind of stuff. But it looks like Saul's pride is going to start to seep in. Some big hit comes to the Philistines. Remember, he just won a battle earlier, and he wants to look good because he wants to be this leader. And now Israel has an established army. They don't have these militias anymore that had to just rise up. They actually have, we have the United States Army. They have the United Israel Army basically now. It was the first actually government-established army, and Saul is here taking the credit. Now, it says the Philistines heard. They might have heard that Jonathan did it, but the Hebrews are going to have to believe, according to Saul, that he was the one that did it. And it also lets them know that Israel became a stench to the Philistines. What that means is there is instances of this back in the past with the digging of wells, if you remember back in Genesis. Basically what it meant is that the Philistines didn't like that the Israelites stood up to them and were bold. It was a stench. It means they hated the people. Israelites were negative. They held it against the Israelites and probably liked the Israelites, probably thought positively of the Israelites maybe because the Israelites were weak. They were subject, and they did whatever the Philistines said. So as long as they listened to the Philistines and followed them, we're going to learn later, there was actually Israelites that went and followed the Philistines. They left the camp of Israel and went to hang out with the Philistines in Philistia. But the Philistines were okay as long as you followed the rules, and they did what the Philistines said. The Philistines were fine with them. But now Jonathan is showing that the Israelites are going to stand up and say, no, we're not going to take it. We're not going to listen to you. We're going to stand up for ourselves, and that became a problem. And we can see that even in our lives with spiritual battles. Now, remember, humans are not our enemies. It's the evil spirits, the principalities, the powers of the air, the darkness, right? So we're fighting against spirits, and they're kind of the same way. They love idle Christians, right? The spirits don't mind you if you call yourself a Christian, but you don't do anything. They don't mind you at all. They're not going to bother you. They might even think positively of you. But once you start doing the Lord's work and you start fighting on behalf of the Lord, kind of like Jonathan did here, when you start spreading the gospel, when you start doing good things, when you start going out in the community, when you start serving at your church, you might be a stench to the enemy. You will be, actually, and that's why you'll get attacks. Sometimes it'll look like it's through people, but remember, there's spirits conniving and convincing people to move at you. So when you have people coming at you and you're getting attacked because you're doing a lot of godly things, and now all of a sudden you notice you're under spiritual attack, remember, it's spiritual. It's not humans you have a problem with. They might just be being used by the enemy. So it's very similar here. We're going to see that the Philistines don't like them, just like the enemy doesn't like us when we do God's work. Then it says the Philistines mustered to fight with Israel 30,000 chariots, so that's a lot bigger number, and 6,000 horsemen and troops like the sand on the seashore. So go look at the grains of sand. You can't even count them on a beach, right? So what this is telling us is the Israelites set back, kind of a little punch in the face to the Philistines, but it wasn't enough to wipe them out. It was just to kind of annoy them. And now Philistines are upset, and they're going to bring out the heavy artillery. Now they're pretty much mobbing the people with a ton. You remember they had 3,000 total in Israel. Well, now you see 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen. So the Philistines are backing it up. They're going to bring in the heavy artillery, and they're not happy now. So they weren't defeated. They were just kind of set back a little bit with that garrison attack from Jonathan. And then it says they encamped in Michmash. Remember, this is just like what we covered last week, where Nahash had them surrounded. And camp means to surround, right? So imagine if you're in your house and all your enemies, whatever was going on or whatever, surrounded you. You'd have no way out. It looks pretty hopeless. And that's how it looked here for the Israelites. Of course, when they saw it, they were hard-pressed. They were surrounded. The people hid themselves in caves, holes, rocks, tombs, cisterns. So basically, it was so bad now, almost like you can kind of imagine a kid that stands up to a bully and punches him, and then the bully stands up really tall, and now the kid wants to run away. They don't want to fight anymore, right? It's kind of what happened with Israel. Israel's probably pretty excited at first, and then, Jonathan does this thing, and now the Philistines want to fight, and now they're scared, and they're running and literally hiding. In caves, cisterns means we're like storages of water. They're hiding in pits, basically, in rocks. They're just hiding because they are afraid because they don't have faith in God. This shows you, again, the turmoil in Israel. They do not have faith in Yahweh, that he is going to help them. They should know the history of their people and how Yahweh stood up in many different ways that it should have been impossible for them to win. They're hiding out like scaredy cats. Some of them, it gets worse. Hebrews even crossed the fords of the Jordan meaning they went east. It means they left the promised land. Remember, they crossed the Jordan River from the east to west to get into the promised land with Joshua. Now they're actually leaving the promised land. That's how scared they are, that they're not even going to hide in the rock. They don't want to even hang out here. They want to flee the promised land that God provided them. So you can see how out of sorts they are, how lacking in faith they are. And now Saul is in charge at Gilgal here, but the people followed him trembling. I mean, they were with him, but they were scared. It means they don't have much faith in him. Isn't it funny how they cheered? Last chapter, they were cheering for Saul as their great leader. Now already, this other battle, now they're trembling. They're surrounded by Philistines. And isn't this just like us to happen where we'll, conquer some spiritual battle? God will help us work through us in something that's going on with our lives. And then we'll face another trial, and then we'll be scared and worried. We have to remember, God's been doing this work the whole time. We just got to trust and have faith in him. But the Israelites, failed at this point here. And that's the first 7 verses. So let's now go on moving along in the chapter here to see what happens next in the verse 8 to 23 here. We're going to learn about Saul's unlawful sacrifice and what that means here. So it says, he waited 7 days, is referring to Saul. He waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. But Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, bring the burnt offering here to me, and the peace offerings. And he offered that burnt offering. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him and greet him. Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, when I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. And Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And Samuel arose and went up from Gilgal. The rest of the people went up after Saul to meet the army. They went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. And Saul numbered the people who were present with him, about 600 men. And Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with them stayed in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. And raiders came out of the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. One company turned toward Ophrah, to the land of Shual. Another company turned toward Beth Horon, and another company turned toward the border that looks down on the valley of Zeboim, toward the wilderness. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears. But every one of the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his sickle. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and for the mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axes and for setting the goads. So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them. And the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. And that's how the chapter ends. So let's break down what's going on and how the chapter ends here. So we just learned that, Jonathan gave the Philistines a setback, but then Saul took credit for it. And now it's funny because Saul took credit for it, and then all the Israelites were scared, right? Scared with him leading. And it says here that Saul waited 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel. So Samuel had told him earlier on to wait 7 days, and Samuel would come, right? And it's hard to wait. It's hard to wait and be patient when there's something to be done. And now you can think of Saul. So you can see his humanness. We know Saul's flawed here. And he's going to make a foolish decision, as Samuel even says. But we can't think that we're much better sometimes, right? So you got to think, Saul's waiting 7 days. They just made this army. His son made this army really angry, although he took credit for it. Now this army's really angry, has them very outnumbered. They're surrounded, and Saul kind of wants to act now, right? He's like, they're kind of on their way. I want to strike now. I want to take care of this before it gets too ugly, before we're really surrounded and we have no hope. Basically what he's saying. But Samuel said, wait 7 days, and then, I'll come there for the sacrifices. Because what Saul knew here, at least, was that God should be sacrificed. God should be sought before battle. David knew that as well. that you should seek the Lord before battle, offer sacrifices, and that was great. But he didn't wait for Samuel. He got impatient, and right at the end there, he just gets impatient, and he does it himself. It does say here that the people were scattering from him, though, so that added to the stress. So not only are they surrounded, but now people are starting to lose hope in him and no longer follow him. Imagine a president who's plummeting in the national polls, right? People are no longer supporting him. They no longer want him to be their leader. It's getting bad. People are running. People are scared. And then he's figuring out, how can I fix this, right? How can I kind of bring this up? So basically what's happening here is he just wants to act now. He's freaked out because they're surrounded, and now he's losing support. So it's doubly worse. So we can see why his flesh would be freaked out and why Saul would want to do this. So he says, bring the burnt offering and the peace offerings to me. And he offered the offerings. I love when it says, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. How interesting is that? So first off, the reason this is a sin, it's a problem, is because the priests were the ones that were supposed to be doing this. And that's why Saul was supposed to wait for Samuel, because he was supposed to be the one to do this. But right before Samuel gets there, isn't this how it goes too? If he would have had just a little bit more patience, Samuel would have showed right up. We think it was less than an hour here. With less than an hour, so he does all this, does this sin, and then Samuel showed up like, all right, guys, I'm here for the sacrifice. And Saul had just done this. So it shows how, had he been patient just a little while longer, there would have been no sin to be had, right? But Samuel showed up, and Saul broke the rules here because only a priest was able to do this. And it's actually worse if you know the Hebrew translations a little bit what goes on here. It says, as soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And then here it says, and Saul went out to meet him and greet him. And that phrase here in Hebrew means he went out to bless him. How ironic is this, right? Because the priest had the authority to bless on the behalf of the Lord. And now Saul's let this whole thing go to his head. Like, oh, well, I'm the priest now. I'm doing offerings. I might as well start passing out blessings, right? What a fool. He is not supposed to. So now he's doubly sinning, right? He doesn't have the authority to do any of this. This is all, God gave this authority to Samuel as he is now a prophet of the nation. But you can see things went to Saul's head. He sacrificed, and while he's at it, he's wearing his priest hat, quote unquote. I'm just using it as a metaphor. He's going to go out and even try to bless the prophet Samuel. So things have really spiraled out of control for Saul here. And Samuel, of course, like an angry parent, was like, what have you done? He could probably smell the death around him. He could smell the sacrifice, the burnt sacrifice. He knew what had happened. And then look at Saul here. Instead of Saul saying, you know what, I've sinned, I'm sorry, Saul seems to realize that he did sin here. But what do we get? We get things that we do to God or do to other people. He says, when I saw people leaving me, excuse number one, well, the people were leaving, I had to do something, right? You did not come within the days appointed. So guess what, Samuel? It's your fault too. So Saul is just going to start playing the blame game. We're going to see. He's like, well, if they wouldn't have left and deserted me, I wouldn't have freaked out. And Samuel, if you would have showed up on time, I wouldn't have had to do this. And then he says, and then the Philistines had mustered at Michmash. And the Philistines, it's their fault too, because they're getting ready to attack soon. If they wouldn't have assembled, I wouldn't have to do this. So right away, Saul blames everybody else but himself. And he knows it's wrong because he's giving excuses, right? He could have just said, if he didn't really think it was wrong, he said, Samuel, it's not a problem. I can do this, right? He knows it's wrong, and he's saying, well, I only sinned because of the Israelites, because of you, Samuel, because of the Philistines. So I've never done this. So it's actually all your guys' fault that I even had to do this. And we do this a lot, where we try to blame and why we had to sin, right? Why it was necessary for us to sin, and there was no other way. And even if we did sin, even if it was wrong, it wasn't our fault. Somebody else made us do it, right? God, I'll just let you know, God does not accept that, right? God does not accept that as an excuse. Saul was guilty of sin here, and it only makes it worse when you pass blame. It's another sign of pride, that you can't reflect on yourself, that you're a failure. Saul didn't want to say, I'm wrong. We all know people like that refuse to say they're wrong, and they'll say, oh, it's a sign of weakness, right? Well, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of honesty, and it's a sign of pride when you won't. But that's what's happening right here. Saul is showing more pride by blaming everybody else. He says the Philistines are going to come down, and he's like, well, I didn't seek favor from the Lord, so now he's going to blame it. Like, I had to. It's almost God's problem, because God requires this kind of thing, and I never talked to him, so I had to talk to him because the Philistines are coming down, and I thought we were going to get into a war, and I didn't want to go into a war without a sacrifice, so it's everybody's fault. It's God's fault that he requires this. It's Philistines' fault. It's your fault. So it's a really bad situation here, basically. He says he forced it, and Samuel rightfully says, you've done foolishly here. Now, foolishly does not mean ignorant here. So you could say somebody's a fool, but if they're ignorant, it just means they didn't know any better. That's actually what ignorant means. Some people call you're ignorant. You can't be ignorant if you know what you're doing. Ignorant means that you are not even aware of what you're doing, right? So he's fully aware, and he's called a fool here, foolish, meaning you knew what was right and you did not do it, right? What's the opposite of foolish? Wisdom, wise, being wise. And being wise is knowing and doing. Being foolish is knowing and not doing, right? So Saul knew the truth. He had the knowledge of the truth, just like anybody who wise has knowledge of the truth. But you can be a wise man or a foolish man based on what you know. And Saul was foolish here, and Samuel tells him that. You knew what God said, and you didn't do it. You have not kept the command that Lord your God gave you, and you knew what he told you to do, and you didn't listen. You didn't wait for me. And he says, it's even worse. He says, had you had listened, Saul, had you had listened to all this, you would have been king forever. You would have been the king. Your dynasty would have lasted. And by the way, that was a big thing in kingdoms. The whole goal was to create a dynasty where your family line would carry it on generation after generation after generation. But Samuel says, no, God's not letting that happen anymore. Basically a prophecy and a curse here. He's going to have judgment. It'll not continue. You'll be the last line of the kings. You just started. It'll be the end of that. And the Lord seeking out a man after his own heart. We know that's going to be David later on, which Jesus' bloodline will come from. And he tells the people there's going to be another guy that'll be prince over Israel. Saul, you're done. You didn't listen. This is why. Just like Moses couldn't go into the promised land because of the one sin he did, this is the sin that gets Saul out of the kingship here because he offered a sacrifice. He wasn't a priest. So what kind of leader is he as a king if he's going to break God's laws? So God says, nope, you're fired. Basically, you're fired. But what's interesting is he's fired, but not fired right away. Similar to Adam and Eve. Remember in the garden when Adam and Eve said, where they were told they will surely die if they ate the fruit? And they ate it, and they didn't die right away, right? You learn they had kids and all that kind of stuff, but they did. They died spiritually there, and at some point they died literally, right? Same thing here with Saul, because Saul's actually going to, reign for probably another 20 or so years after this event. So I'm sure there was people saying, oh, I thought God said you weren't going to be king anymore. You're still king. You didn't get taken off the throne yet, right? But some things don't always happen immediately, and Saul will be taken off the throne, as we know, if you've read ahead before. And then it says that, after this judgment, and Samuel kind of delivers this prophecy. Samuel went up, he leaves, and the rest of the people went up after Saul with him to Gibeah, Benjamin. And now you see Saul number the people, and now they're only down to 600 people. So he's lost 80% of his military. So you can see why he was a little terrified. 80% of his people left. And that's why he was freaking out. He thought he'd have no army. And now the Philistines are getting stronger, and his army is getting weaker, right? So he's down to 600 men also, which is really interesting. Remember when the Benjaminites got in that war back at the end of Judges, and they were wiped out to 600 men? You can see some kind of tie here, where Benjamin, getting wiped back down to 600 men, a small remnant here of what once was. Then it says Saul and Jonathan, his son, and the people who were present with him, stayed in Gibeah of Benjamin, and then the Philistines surrounded him. So they're surrounded. And raiders came out, meaning they were coming in raiding the people of Philistines. And why would they be afraid to raid? They wouldn't be, because the Philistines had them so outnumbered, they could just send guys in, right? And they still had a full army. So now they're just kind of picking them off. It was almost not fair. Think of it almost like, imagine if the NFL or the football changed the rules where you had 5 linemen blocking, but you had, 30 guys on defense. It wouldn't hurt you to send 10 guys blitzing, because you still have a whole defense back there. It's kind of what's happened. Philistines started blitzing Israel, because why not? They outnumbered them. What was the harm? They were going on the offense now. They set up 3 different camps to do this. They had a little bit of a strategy going on here. And then we start to learn about there was no blacksmith. Now, why is this important? There's no blacksmith in Israel, so basically they were financially bound to the Philistines. It means they couldn't have weapons. Could you imagine? The Philistines are their enemies, and in order to get their weapons, they had to go to the Philistines. Could you imagine like a war between, imagine just for example, say Russia and Ukraine. Imagine if Ukraine, to fight back with Russia, had to buy their weapons from Russia and get their ammos and get their guns cleaned by Russians, right? How would this make any sense, right? But this is how it was. The Philistines had power. They were oppressing Israel, and Israel actually had to pay. Not only did they have to pay money, they had to pay a high price to get all of this taken care of. 2/3 of a shekel, and then they had a third of a shekel just for the sharpening then, right? And one commentator even says, and when they sharpen them, it wasn't even the best job, right? Because it was the enemy. Why? The blades were never going to come back pristine. And why would they? Because you keep them a little bit dull. They're not good to be used, and they're going to have to come back and sharpen them, pay you more money, right? It was kind of a financial trap. They're also financial slaves. On top of physical slaves, financial slaves. You can see that in our world today, by the way. That's why it says, the borrower's slave to the lender, the Bible says that, because of the same reason. And what happens is credit cards do that to people, do exactly what the Philistines do. They keep you in such debt, you have to pay such these high prices that you can never get back on top. And that's exactly what happened. They were slaves. Sometimes people are financial slaves, just like the Bible said that they are. And the system in America sometimes can even be set up like that, where everybody's suffering and costs so much just to do what you need to do. But that was what's going on here. They had to get all their tools sharpened, and they didn't have any money to have the weapons, right? So they're kind of already kept oppressed because of their financial situation. Even if the Israelites want to rise up, they don't even have the money to rise up, right? So it's just a really bad situation. Like I said, just like if the Russians were charging the Ukrainians money. They're already outnumbered. They're already fighting a bigger nation. Now they have to pay money. It wouldn't make sense, right? It would be unfair. That's what was going on here. And we find out because of that, they were so poor, they couldn't afford it, that they couldn't even have weapons. So could you imagine the United States Army having to go out and fighting a war, but our nation didn't have weapons? Only the congressmen and the presidents had weapons, right? Or the generals. Only the generals had the weapons. None of the soldiers, anybody else had them. Just the generals. So that's kind of what was going on here. Only Saul and Jonathan had weapons. So now they're fighting the Philistines without weapons on top of it. It is very lopsided. You can see why things were getting a little crazy. And then it ends here. Isn't it interesting how the chapter ends? And I just noticed this as we were reading here. The garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of Michmash. So remember, it all started out with the garrison getting defeated by Jonathan to kind of set them back. And now they're kind of showing they've replenished, and now a garrison is going out out to the pass of Michmash. So now Philistines have gone on the offense. So it was kind of a little setback against Philistines to start out, and now the Philistines definitely have the upper hand. They have outnumbered them. Don't forget that the Philistines lived on the sea. They traded with the Greeks, who were very well-oriented. They had the top technology. Imagine if, there's an army fighting with just knives and swords, and then you have another military fighting with AI, right? And droids and, robots. It's kind of how it was here. The technology was also incredible because they were able to learn from other nations, or the Israelites couldn't. So the Philistines were very top-notch with technology of war. They had great strategies. They had more people. It was just completely outnumbered. They checked the box in every way. This is supposed to be a landslide fight. You can see why the people were afraid and why Saul might have been worried, because if you look at it from a human standpoint, a fleshly standpoint, they should have been wiped out. But they should have also known from their people's history and how God is faithful, that they could have turned to him, and this wouldn't be a problem at all. And that's how chapter 13 ended. Does anybody have anything they want to say? Any questions, any comments as far as chapter 13 goes there? Yeah, Howard.
I guess kind of how, and when the people are leaving him, and Samuel, it seems like Samuel's late. It kind of makes me think of like in the lives of Christians, when it seems like the enemy, like when we're being oppressed or something, and we start losing hope, and our friends start scattering, and it seems like the Lord's salvation is late in coming. Like, we have to be patient and wait a little longer.
Amen. That's a deep thought, thing brought up by the Holy Spirit there, Howard.
Just a little bit longer,
right?
Samuel would have showed up.
Showed up right on time, which is how awesome is that? That's an awesome observation there. Such a cool observation, and I love how you even tied it in there to when you turn to Christ the first time, you're going to lose some friends. I've actually been unfriended by people. I'm still finding out today. Every once in a while, I'll be recommended to somebody that I thought was I was friends on Facebook, and then I found out it was one of the people that was an atheist that I saw at music festivals or something, and they must not like I'm posting all these videos online. So you're going to lose people, and you just have to be okay with it. But it can get scary if you lose all your friends. In some situations, when you become a Christian, you might have no Christian friends. You have to plug into the church and start to find, so you feel abandoned, and you might feel like God's left you behind. But I love what he said there: be patient on the salvation of the Lord, and it will come right on time. Just like if he would have waited on Samuel's going to show up. Wait on the Lord, trust in him. If you're losing your friends, you're going through a hard time, the Lord will deliver for you. You just got to be patient and trust in him. So that's awesome, Howard. Yeah, Phil.
So riding on that, I had a spot that I wanted to mention as well, because when looking at how Saul should have waited, and he was a little more anxious or like more, he should have had a little more patience. It makes me think about Daniel when he was fasting for those 21 days, and the archangel was caught, like held up by, I believe, the Prince of Persia. And so there's a reason why there is a delay. So it makes me think of God's working in all ways.
That's awesome. Yeah, so that's another story you can see. He's referencing Daniel, I think it's chapter 10, I believe, where Daniel fasts for 3 weeks, and then finally the angel comes and he says, I've been held up in the spirit realm for 3 weeks. So Phil's even making a great point there that sometimes the delay is purpose. There's a spiritual reason to it. And don't forget, God allows, if there's a delay, God's allowing it. Nothing can delay God's plan other than God, which means it was his plan anyways, but it's not a delay. So Samuel was right on time. He looked late to Saul because Saul is sweating it. Like we said, all these things going on. But Samuel is not late. He was right on time. But things can look from our perspective like they're delaying, right? And that's the point here, to be faithful. Even Daniel, imagine fasting 3 weeks and nothing happening, like he said in Daniel. But Daniel was right to do that. Daniel didn't stop after a week or 2 weeks. I might have been wanting to, like, hey, nothing's happening here. You know, I'm kind of ready to move on. But Daniel was patient and trusted in the Lord and was able to see some results from that. So it shows it's a great biblical example to be patient. Anybody else with any thoughts or questions or comments based on chapter 13? All right, let's go ahead and finish up. We're going to do chapter 14 here. We'll start out we're going to do a big chunk, the first 23 verses. There's a lot of verses in this chapter. So we're going to cruise through it here and break it all down. First 23 verses. Here we go, where Jonathan now says, Jonathan defeats the Philistines. We're going to see something similar to how the chapter 13 started. So verse 1 and 14. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah in the pomegranate cave at Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men, including Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, son of Phinehas, son of Eli, the priest of the Lord in Shiloh, wearing an ephod. And the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. Within the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistine garrison, there was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. The name of the one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The one crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. Jonathan said to the young man who carried his armor, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. And his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart, do as you wish. Behold, I am with you heart and soul. Then Jonathan said, behold, we will cross over to the men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for the Lord has given them into our hand. And this shall be the sign to us. So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, look, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. And the men of the garrison hailed Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show you a thing. And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hand of Israel. Then Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike which Jonathan and his armor bearer made killed about 20 men within, as it were, half a furrow's length and an acre of land. And there was a panic in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic. And the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude was dispersing here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, count and see who has gone from us. And when they had counted, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here. For the ark of God went at that time with the people of Israel. Now while Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the camp of the Philistines increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, withdraw your hand. Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword was against his fellow, and there was great confusion. Now the Hebrews who had been with the Philistines before that time and who had gone up with them into the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, when all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were fleeing, they too followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. And that is the first 23 chapters. We're going to go ahead or first 23 verses that we're going to break down right here. So now again, it's starting with Jonathan taking action. He's showing the godliness here. It says one day, he went with his, the man who carried his armor bearer. So back then, if you were an officer, Jonathan was high ranking, you had an officer to kind of help you out. It was basically your assistant. Had to be brave because they were responsible for keeping their person alive, or their officer alive, and helping and assisting with carrying the armor and administrating the military. So he says, hey, let's go up, to the Philistine garrison. Remember, this is how the whole thing started, where he defeated that first one. And he didn't tell his father, so it was a secret. Says Saul was actually out here. So while there's all these things to do, they say the sacrifice, Saul's doing nothing. He's kind of sitting and just hoping things get better, right? He's hanging out in a pomegranate cave or maybe under a tree, some translations say. Meanwhile, Jonathan's ready to take action, right? Which shows us something here. It's good to wait on the Lord and trust in him, but sometimes it also requires action. You can't just stand there and pray that fire comes down from heaven all the time. You also have to show action, and God can maybe send some fire. Just we see the earthquake here. God does act, but you see an action by Jonathan as well. So Jonathan is showing godly action here. Saul's kind of waiting back in Gibeah here. And, remember, there's 600 men, and it says including Ahijah here, son of Ahitub, and it breaks it basically down to be the son of Phinehas, who was the evil son of Eli, if you remember. And you remember Ichabod was the baby that was born at the one at the end of the chapter, just kind of randomly mentioned. Here his name comes up here again, and I think it's important what his name means. It means the glory has departed. The glory of the Lord has departed. So most likely this whole genealogy little rundown here of who's priest, it ties into that family here, but it's also showing us, I think, now what's happening spiritually. Saul's glory is departing him. It started out great. He was humble. He was a humble leader. He wasn't fighting his enemies. He was like his critics. He was just going to be a good, humble leader. Now the glory of the Lord is departing. And I think that's why Ichabod is mentioned, that Ahijah comes from his family. One of the reasons, anyway. So we can see that spiritually things are turning. We also learned the people did not know that Jonathan had gone. So Jonathan's not being prideful. That's a guarantee right there. If he wanted to be the hero, he would have said, hey, everybody, watch what I'm going to do. Watch me. I'm going to go fight for us, right? But he does it secretly. Probably for multiple reasons. One, because he's trying to be modest, and he just wants to do what's right. He doesn't care who knows and who doesn't. And maybe number two, he's worried that his dad will say no, right? It's almost like you don't want to ask your parents sometimes when you're a kid, because if they say no, then you're done, right? So it's just better not to ask for forgiveness later, right? That's kind of the policy he's taking. I'll just ask for forgiveness later. And he's going to do this. He's going to take over and do a godly thing, but he's just going to go and take things into his hands with the Philistine garrison there. And now we see when he goes up, he takes some strategy here. There's rocky crags. So basically, although he's outnumbered, there's a lot of other people compared to him, and it's just two guys, right? Jonathan and his armor bearer. But there's a strategy. It's a little rocky, right? So it'd be like, hiking in a field is different. People can just run and sprint in a field, but if you're hiking in a mountain, there's actually good rock boulders on the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania, some of the toughest to climb. It's toughest for Appalachian Trail hikers to go through Pennsylvania, because you have to go over these big rocks and go down a rock, then go back over a rock and down a rock. It really slows your mileage down. Any Appalachian Trail hiker will tell you that. Same thing here. It slowed down the army, so it actually kind of evened it out, and he approaches through these rocky crags. So there'd have to be a clear path, right? They can't surround him, they can't attack him from all over. So that's a little added note there. Which is really interesting. That says, now Jonathan said, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Maybe the Lord will work with us. And I love what he says here. For nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. Jonathan is showing spiritual wisdom. He knows the history books. He knows the history of his people, what God has done, right? He knows what he did, and we're going to see some of this happen here. He knows what he did back in Gideon's day when Gideon only had, 300, right? They have 600. They have double what Gideon had. Gideon had 300 in the time of the Judges, the previous book, and God wanted a miraculous in a miraculous way there. So you're seeing his boldness. Says, hey, nothing can stop God's plan. It doesn't matter if we look outnumbered. I am going to be spiritually wise and know that this is the Lord's battle. So we're seeing some great wisdom here by him. And then what we see here, the armor bearer agrees, which is awesome. He's going to stand there. And we see here that although people are called to godly action, there's always other people added to the mix. Usually if somebody has a godly mission on their heart, somebody wants to carry out something, there's usually other Christians you're going to find that God sends to help them, and they're just as important. This armor bearer is going to be just as important as Jonathan. Jonathan is just kind of the leader here. And I love what Jonathan says. He's going to trust in the Lord here. And again, we're seeing this in 1 Samuel. We're seeing how you don't always have to act on one hasty thing, like you get a message from the Lord and I'm just going to run with it. Jonathan's going to say, hey, I believe God has been leading me to attack here, but I'm just going to wait, make sure that I'm not getting ahead of myself. And I don't think it's like a Gideon thing where he's like testing the Lord. I think he's testing himself. Jonathan wants to make sure, he wants to say, like, I don't want to take this into my own hands and be wrong. I want to make sure this is what the Lord really wants me to do. And here's how we're going to find out from the sign. If they call us over, that's a sign from God. If not, we're going to stay over here and not fight. But you see that they say to come up to them. And it's funny because the Philistines think that Jonathan and the armor bearer, they don't know who he is. And they say, oh, look, they're coming out of the caves. They're coming out from hiding. Basically, they want to give themselves up. So come on over. They think they're surrendering. How ironic. They think they're surrendering. And they tell him to come up over there. So this is Jonathan's sign. And they decide to go over there. And he says, God has given us. He's given us to them. So Jonathan agrees. And then it says Jonathan climbed up on his hands and feet. So think about that. Hands and feet. He had like bear crawl up. So imagine climbing up a really rocky mountain, almost like rock climbing. Again, the rocky crags. This is not an easy way. Again, like I said, go hiking through the boulder fields of the Appalachian Trail in Pennsylvania and then hike another area and see how much more difficult it is. It's showing the difficulty of having to get up there. But we see here that Jonathan wins. They fall to him, and they killed about 20 men. And he might have even been thinking, too, about Shamgar. Remember the story of Shamgar? It's really not even a story. It's like a sentence or two in the Bible. But Shamgar is one of the first judges, minor judges mentioned. He killed 600 Philistines with a goad, right, with a sharp, pointy stick. He might be thinking, well, hey, all I know about Shamgar is he killed 600 of these guys by himself. Me and you, there's two of us. We can go fight them, and they killed 20 of them. So kind of a Shamgar situation. Again, God showing that he does the work. It's not Jonathan's battle with the Lord's help. It's the Lord's battle using Jonathan and the armor bearer to carry this out, the armor bearer. Now you see that the raiders of the Philistines trembled. Now the ones that are attacking, they're scared. And we see God partner with Jonathan. Jonathan started the action, but now God is sending an earthquake and a panic. He's giving them anxiety attacks and freaking them out, basically. Sending an earthquake. So now we're seeing God do his part, or the earth shaking. Now there's supernatural events taking place. So God is clearly teaming up, and Jonathan's wisdom, and by knowing the Lord and knowing Yahweh's true character, this leads to victory. And we see, again, this is the Lord's battle. And just like in our lives, we can pray to the Lord for help, and the Lord will intercede, and he can send earthquakes into our enemies' lives, the spiritual enemies, so to speak. But it still requires us to get on our hands and knees and sometimes put some effort in too, right? So we got to meet the Lord halfway sometimes. Now, sometimes God will do it all. Sometimes God has to do it all, right? Because of divine appointments, things like that. But sometimes we have to put forth effort, knowing that God can work through us. But we actually have to do some physical labor and some physical things to get the mission out there, right? And Jonathan shows us this. And then Jonathan acted first. Sometimes we have to act first on what God calls us to do when he confirms his word. And then we're going to start to see the Lord show up supernaturally in our lives then maybe. Sometimes God has us start, and then God will show up, right? It doesn't always start with an earthquake and fire raining down. Sometimes it starts with our obedience, and then God continues to show up in miraculous ways, right? Then we see something interesting here. The watchmen who are watching out, they notice that the Philistines are starting to run. Saul's guys are like, wait a minute. They're starting to leave and disperse. Saul knows something's going on. He's like, hey, check what's going on. Somebody must have attacked them. Something must be going on that they're running away. This doesn't make any sense. Check our camps. Who's missing? And they come to find out that Jonathan, his own son, and the armor bearer were not there. So, it says that he asked them to bring the ark of God there. So Saul's summoning God again here. When he's talking to Bracy, he tells him to withdraw his hand and then stop the action. You can see Saul's wishy-washy. He's like, wait a minute, hold on. Saul and all the other people who were with him rallied and went into the battle. And behold, every Philistine's sword against his fell, and there was great confusion. So now we're seeing again Similar battle to Gideon. When Gideon was able to win with 300 men, remember, it doesn't matter if you're outnumbered. God has ways to win. They won with smashing pots and flames and shouting. And there's confusion. Very similar thing, that same motif again. That you can win with your outnumbered because God will use supernatural causes. He caused a panic in the camp, and it happened. But we're also going to notice some other things here. God's winning here supernaturally, but you're seeing the fair weather fans come out now. Now, remember, the Saul and all the people were terrified. They're hiding out in caves, and now it's going to end with all the men of Israel who were hidden themselves now heard that they were fleeing, and they came out and won. Kind of reminds me of the people, like, again, I'm going to just use a sports reference, playoff football fans who don't watch the thing at all, and now their team's in the playoffs, and they're a game or two away from the Super Bowl, and all of a sudden, they're wearing jerseys, the biggest fan, they're going to get the games, they're going to stop what they're doing in their lives, and they're going to cheer all of a sudden, right? Kind of what happens here. Now that the Philistines are on the run, they're going to join the fight and say, yeah, you get running, I'm a part of this. And really, they're fair weather fans. Why weren't they coming out of their caves before with Jonathan originally? Why aren't they standing up? Why weren't they trusting in God, saying, God, I know we're outnumbered, but we know what you did with Gideon. We know what you did with Jericho. We know what you did in Egypt. You're the same God. We're going to trust in you. Instead, they hid until it looked good, and then they came out of their caves. Literally, like they say, they come out of the woodwork, right? They're coming out of the woodwork. They're coming out of caves and cisterns and saying, yeah, we're going to fight now. So fair weather fans, right? And you'll see that in Christianity, by the way. Be careful. You'll see people around you who you think are Christians, and they're cheering because right now we live in America where you can still be a Christian and you're not going to get killed like you will in Afghanistan or some of these other places in China. But once things get bad, once things get bad here and persecution comes, you're going to see people, the so-called Christians who aren't Christians, hide and flee, and things are going to be kind of reversed what's going on here. But right now, there's people call themselves Christians, and they love God, and they love Jesus right now because there's no persecution. One thing the Bible tells us about this, there's going to be people that when things get tough, they're going to run and hide and flee from the Lord. They're not going to longer stand with him. So there's a sign here. Don't be a fair weather fan. Don't hide and when things are hard and only be for God when things are going good. You have to stand with him, and you actually need him even more when things are bad. And I love what it says. The Lord saved Israel that day. It didn't say Jonathan did. It says the Lord did. And Jesus, again, is always fighting in the spiritual realm. So Jesus Christ himself, we're seeing his salvation story right here. He saves them. They should have been mopped up by the Philistines, but God saves them supernaturally. The Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed beyond Beth Aven. And now let's go ahead. We're just going to finish up 24 verses to 46. Saul's rash vow. Things are going to get worse. You're going to see, again, another motif from the book of Judges. If you read the book of Judges, a lot of the stuff you're going to see happening is very familiar. Patterns happening over and over that's happened before. So let's go ahead and read. And the men of Israel had been hard-pressed that day, so Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged on my enemies. So none of the people had tasted food. Now when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping. But no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charge the people with the oath, so he put out the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Then one of the people said, Your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, Cursed be the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. Then Jonathan said, My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey? How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies and that they had found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. They struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ajalon, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. Then they told Saul, Behold, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. And he said, You have dealt treacherously. Roll a great stone to me here. And Saul said, Disperse yourselves among the people and say to them, Let every man bring his ox or his sheep and slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating with the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night, and they slaughtered them there. And Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first altar that he had built to the Lord. Then Saul said, Let us go down after the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light. Let us not leave a man of them. And they said, Do whatever seems good to you. But the priest said, Let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. And Saul said, come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how the sin has arisen today. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But there was not a man among the people who answered him. Then he said to all Israel, you shall be on one side, and I on Jonathan my son will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord, God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people of Israel, give Thummim. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, cast a lot between me and my son Jonathan. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I will die. And Saul said, God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan, so that he did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. So interesting here, we see Saul makes this vow, this rash vow here, basically saying, they're pursuing the Philistines. So the Philistines are running. Now Israelites have an upper hand, and Jonathan thinks this should be great. It should be a great battle. We're winning in the Philistines here, but Saul takes it into his own hands. Saul is going to get selfish again. We're seeing his selfishness. He says, this is my battle. We're going to go after my enemies, and nobody's going to eat until we get my enemies. It's all about Saul, isn't it? Saul, Saul, Saul. It's not about God. It's about Saul here, and that's the problem. Just like we sometimes will take God's identity, God will be doing something, and we'll call God's enemies our enemies and make ourselves the center of the story, when really Christ should be the center, and Christ is the one saving them. God is the one saving Israel here, but Saul's going to make this all about him, and he says, nobody's going to eat until we get my enemies. And that's a really crazy vow here. And you can see God's blessing in abundance. They go in, they see honey everywhere, which is a sugar. You see that people are faint, they're tired, they're hungry, they haven't eaten, they've been in battle, they need energy. Honey everywhere. It's actually dropping. It's like dripping down. There's honeycombs everywhere. God has blessed them. And Saul's saying, nobody eat, right? Now, Saul wanted to, fast. That's great. But I think he's trying to be a spiritual hero here. He's trying to be one of those bold, zealot heroes, and he's not even godly. We're seeing he's very prideful. He could have said, hey, guys, I'm going to fast. If any of you want to fast this battle with me, go ahead. That would probably have been the more wise thing to do, especially if they're low on energy and they need energy to fight, right? But he doesn't do that. And we see that Jonathan, he started this whole war. He fought. He crawled up on his hands and feet. He's going to eat the honey. He didn't hear this oath and this command happen in here, it says. And then, of course, you can imagine the one guy gasped, like, oh, Jonathan, no, your father said, he made an oath that whoever eats will be cursed and have to die. And then it mentions here the people were faint. So right after he tells them this, he's like, oh, by the way, everybody was out of energy, by the way. They could have really used this honey here. And now I love Jonathan says, Jonathan probably should have been more respectful because his dad's the king. I get it. But what Jonathan says here is right. He might have had, maybe he's sinful here by not showing respect. But Jonathan just kind of gets frustrated and like, I started to fight the Philistines here. I just led the charge here. And now we're chasing out the Philistines. My dad's really causing some problems here, he says. I ate, my eyes got bright. I got the energy, and now I'm in trouble for this. How much better if the people had been able to eat freely and get the spoils? But now the defeat of the Philistines isn't that good. Like, we're winning the battle, but how great is it that we can't even eat? We can't even continue on here. My dad's really kind of screwed things up here. So he's upset that Saul did this foolish thing when he should be letting his men eat. And God's clearly blessed them with the honey around, and they could use the energy. They're still fighting. The battle's not completely won, but they're still chasing them out. It then says they struck down the Philistines, so they did win, but the people were very faint. So remember, they had to keep their vow of not eating, and they did. They win. Jonathan ate, but it doesn't say any of the others did, but they were very faint. And right after this, they pounced on the spoil. Imagine they're starving. So now they take the sheep, oxen, cows. So meat, I like, steaks and burgers, right? So now they're thinking, oh, I'm so hungry, I can really go for a burger right now or whatever. They would have said back then they probably didn't eat burgers, but you know what I mean here. But what they did is they were so hungry now because their situation, they were starving. Imagine if you had to fast, and now dinner's here, and you go out and grab a plate and you wolf it down, you eat it as fast as you can. That's what happened here. But the problem is they didn't drain blood out. And that was a law, if you go back in the books of Moses, that was a law that you had to drain all the blood. And it was probably a science thing. God's probably saying it's not healthy to, take in blood, but this is part of the law. So now they're breaking the law by doing this, but they're just so starving, hungry because of everything. And then you look at what Saul does here. Somebody says, "Hey, Saul, they're sinning. They're eating with blood." And I love it. I don't love. I can't believe Saul says. He goes, "You guys have dealt treacherously. Like, oh, what sinners! You guys are breaking the rules. You know you shouldn't be doing that." But you just go back a little bit and you saw Saul sacrificing, right? Way worse almost. I mean, there's no worse or little. Every sin is a sin to God. But how can the king offer sacrifices, know he's wrong, come up with all these excuses, and then turn? And we see this in the Bible. We see examples of this. The guy who owed a lot of money, he's forgiven, then he chokes the guy that owes him money. Same kind of thing here. Saul's like chastising the people and saying they're sinful. First off, by the way, we could also look and say, well, Saul, you starved the people. You didn't really set them up for really good success, right? As their leader, you almost set them up to tempt them into sin. But Saul sees the blame again. He's selfish. He's prideful. This couldn't be Saul's problem. Saul couldn't have let these people into a very tempting situation. It must be their sinful ways. I can't believe it, right? Saul is so full of himself. He's shown to be a really bad leader, just like was prophesied earlier by Samuel when the Lord told him what was going to happen. And now Saul's like, you know what? Bring a stone to me here. Why he wants that, by the way, is you had to put an animal up on the stone to drain the blood. That's how you drained it. You use gravity, power of gravity. You cut the animal, the blood drains out. You have to get up stone. So Saul's like, hey, give me a stone. I'll fix it. Somebody bring me a stone. We'll do it the right way. And that's what he's doing here. Everybody brought their, he tells them to bring the ox, the sheep, and do not sin by eating with the blood. I'll help you drain it. So Saul's trying to be the big guy here. And it says everyone brought him, and Saul then built an altar. First one he ever built to the Lord, by the way. And he built an altar there. Then Saul wants to go down and plunder the Philistines. So he goes and does that. Everybody agrees. The priest says, let us draw near to God here. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down? So this is good. He's asking actually God. Saul's showing some wisdom here. Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them to the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. God's not answering. So there's a problem here. God is not answering him. And we're going to find out why here. Saul knows something's up. It says, come here, all you leaders of the people, and know and see how this sin has risen today. For as the Lord who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. So Saul's about to say, we got to figure out the problem. Even if it's my son, he's going to die. Although I don't think he would have said that had he had known what was really going on here. He even says, all right, all of Israel over here, me and my son Jonathan over here, we're going to use the Urim and the Thummim. It's kind of like how they would reach into this pallet spot, almost like dice that God would use, that the priest was supposed to use this. It was a legal divination, the only divination they were allowed to use to see what God wanted is how they did this. And he's like, me and Jonathan over here, the rest of you guys over there. And they do it, the Urim and Thummim. It shows that Jonathan and Saul are at fault. So Saul's like, all right, let's see what goes here. And Jonathan is the one that's guilty. So Saul still didn't know that he was the one that ate of this. It says Jonathan and Saul were taken. They cast lot, and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. Jonathan says, I tasted a little honey, and I guess I'll die. So Jonathan, again, showing his godliness. Yep, if I broke your oath, it's a stupid oath, but I broke it, and if I broke it, let's honor it. All right, I'll die, right? So Jonathan shows some godliness and respect for the king here. And then Saul says, God, do so to me and more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. And the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan surely die? So what happens here is Saul is pulling a Jephthah, right? All you have to do is go back to the book of Judges. We learn about Jephthah. He made a stupid vow, says, whatever comes out, he didn't know it was going to be his daughter. Whatever comes out of the house, I'll kill and sacrifice. And it was his daughter. And Jephthah didn't know Yahweh so well, knowing that Yahweh would prefer, mercy over sacrifice. The Bible says that later on. And Jephthah was foolish because of that, and he killed his daughter. It was foolish. But here you see Saul. He didn't learn anything from history. He didn't know anything about Jephthah, or if he did, he didn't listen to it. And he's saying, well, Saul or Jonathan, I'm going to have to kill you. Yep, you are going to have to die because that's what my oath was, right? So he's showing the same foolishness that we saw in the book of Judges, Saul does not get who God really is and his godliness here. And then it says, then the people said, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground. And the people ransomed, it says, Jonathan. He did not die. Then Saul went up from pursuing the Philistine. The Philistine went to their own place. And that's how that ends there. So it's really interesting. So instead, in Jephthah, the daughter's killed, and after she's able to go out in the mountain and cry. Here, the people stand up and say, whoa, Saul, wait a minute. Why are you killing your son? Why would Jonathan have to die? Wasn't he the one that did all this stuff, that helped save Israel? That the Lord saved us, but didn't Jonathan stand up for us? Isn't this the whole reason that we've defeated the Philistines? Because of Jonathan? Why are you going to kill him? And it actually brings Saul to his senses. So this is a good sign to us that Christians, godly Christians, can stand up. Sometimes Christian leaders aren't perfect. You should know this. Jesus Christ is the only man, because he was God and man, the only one who's ever perfect is always going to make the right decisions. So if you see something sinful, it's okay to stand up, and it can change the course of action. Saul said that he was going to kill Jonathan, his son, right here, until the people stood up and said, wait a minute, Jonathan's been very godly in this situation. He only didn't follow your little oath about honey, and we were all faint and hungry. And actually, your oath ended up leading the people into sin, even more sin, by eating it with blood because they're so hungry. You should let Jonathan go. And Saul actually listened. So that's a cool little note there, that if the leaders are doing something sinful, or some other Christian is doing something sinful, it's right to stand up, and you can do it in a loving manner, but point like, hey, I think this is the godly way to go about things. I know this is the way you're approaching it, but I really believe this is the godly way, and it can make a difference, and leaders can change their minds because they're not perfect, and we see that here. And that's how chapter 14 ends. Do we have any questions? Oh, we do have still a chapter. I almost closed up. We still have 47:52. I'm getting too early here. I realize I have one more slide to go to yet, or one more bit here. I almost stopped this too early. Here we go. Saul fights Israel's enemies. So we got to continue on. I'm glad I didn't end early there. I was just seeing if you guys were awake, and you guys are. So let's finish on the last couple of verses here. When Saul had taken the kingship over Israel, he fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the Ammonites, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he routed them. And he did valiantly and struck the Amalekites and delivered Israel out of the hands of those who plundered them. Now the sons of Saul were Jonathan, Ishvi, and Malchi-Shua. And the names of his two daughters were these. The name of the firstborn was Merab, and the name of the younger, Michal. And the name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz. And the name of the commander of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner, the father of Abner, was the son of Abiel. There was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. So, although earlier that did kind of end the story of the battle here, this little ending, you could almost call it an outro to the chapter, is going to focus on Saul's kingship. It's basically showing his military might, that although he was sinful, there were some battles that he did win for Israel with the power of the Lord. You see the Ammonites, which we saw earlier, Moab, Edom, Zobah, and of course the Philistines. And we learn here that there was hard fighting against the Philistines all the days of Saul. So even after this little battle here that we just saw, the Philistines are still a problem all of Saul's kingship. And later on we know that with David, the Philistines are a problem when David shows up on the scene here. So we basically, that first paragraph there shows Saul's military might, his military power, and then it pivots to his family here. So now it goes into a little bit of a genealogy. We see Jonathan, we see Ishvi. Maybe Ishvi is Ishbosheth, we don't know. Or maybe Ishbosheth is not named here. And we see Malchi-Shua. We see his daughters, Merab and Michal, which later will come up in the story of David. We're going to learn about that. And then Abner, who's actually Saul's cousin, as we're seeing here. And Abner's going to play a big deal later. Things are going to get weird. There's going to be some controversy, some scandal with Abner later on we're going to find. And Abner's going to eventually follow David later. But we're going to get introduced to Saul's family. Basically, it's showing here that Saul was a military leader during his time as king. And not only that, he had a very influential and large family. And we get an introduction here to some names that we're going to see later. Like I said, David's wife, Michal. We're going to see some interesting things there. Just like, I was going to say Bathsheba. She was not the first one that David took. It was Michal. So we're going to see her play into this later. But we're just getting a little bit of an intro to the genealogy and some people that are going to come into play later on. So does anybody have any questions? Now that's the end of the chapter, really, although it was a little outro there. That's actually the end of the chapter. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the entire chapter 14 there? Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
Two really quick observations. The first is that very last verse, in verse 52, where it says, "And when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he took him unto him." Later, we'll see David also surround himself with strong men. However, what's interesting is that Saul appears here to seek out strong men.
Right.
Because he seems to place value on the strength of men, whereas David's godliness actually draws men to him that themselves have been oppressed and are broken.
Wow.
So awesome. I just think that that's a really cool observation. But the second point that I think is really cool is that, going back to a point you made earlier, and I think this is a great application on how we can apply grace to each other as Christians. So when you compare in chapter 13 Samuel's words to Saul when he discovers that he made the sacrifice without him, and he says, "What hast thou done?" in that accusing manner. And then when Saul says to Jonathan, "Tell me what thou hast done," in chapter 14 in verse 43. What Saul did, he deserved to die, really.
Right.
But he was allowed to live even though God took away the kingdom from him, and he still continued to live long after that.
Right.
And then he's so quick to apply a death sentence to someone else, and he even uses that same language. "What have you done?"
Right. You should die.
I mean, like, when we go through our walk, I mean, like, we were all sinners,
Right.
bound for hell at one point or another. I mean, we were all dead, and God showed grace to us. We can now apply that to others.
Amen.
Instead of having that same accusatory tone, because God had every right to accuse us,
Right.
but instead he saved us,
Amen. That's awesome observation. I love that. Again, just showing the two differences, just like I said in the New Testament, where the one guy strangles the guy after he was forgiven. Same thing here, because he's right. That and any of these offenses, especially one of the priests, we've seen people in the past. We saw Nadab and Abihu way back in the Old Testament or in the books of Moses, where they died because they used profane fire, right? And we've seen other people die. We saw Khan die. We saw a lot of people die for breaking laws. And Saul was granted mercy here, and then he turns right around and tells his own son, "Well, you got to die for the silly oath I made," by the way. Think about that, too. Saul is going to die because of God's rules, and John's going to die because of Saul's rules. Like, this is really bizarre. God had mercy on Saul for God's real laws, and then Saul makes some stupid rule about not being able to eat honey, and now Jonathan is going to pay for that, right? Because really, Jonathan didn't really sin by eating the honey. He only sinned against the oath that was made, right? And then Jonathan, still like a godly man, says, "All right, I'll take my punishment of death," right? Like, how crazy is that? Saul didn't say, like, "Oh, Samuel, you're right. God, kill me." Like, again, we're seeing the selfishness of Saul, and you'll see this in other Christians, that will be forgiven much by the Lord, and then they'll hold, like, "Oh, can you believe what they did last weekend? What such sinners?" It's like, do you remember that you should have, you were supposed to go to hell too, right? It's that attitude, and God doesn't like that, and we see Saul show that here. We see other Christians in our lives kind of show that it's no good. It's the hypocritical thing to do, because we all are sinners. If you're not Jesus Christ, which none of us are, you're a sinner and you failed at some point. So we have to have grace and mercy, because God has had grace and mercy with us, and everybody's growing in their own faith. But yeah, that's a great observation to make there. So that's awesome. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, thanks again for watching, everybody. We'll continue on next week. Just going to keep going 2 chapters at a time, Lord willing. 1 Samuel 15 and 16. So read ahead. You'll be a little bit more comfortable. If you don't read ahead, that's okay, because we're going to read verse by verse with you anyway. Go ahead and review anything that we read here, and maybe you can come back later with some more insights that we might not have touched upon. But you can see this is all rich in the gospel message, and God's speaking us in so many ways. That's why we love to slow down and break this all down. You can read a chapter of the Bible and blow through it. But when you slow down and really think about it, we're really getting a lot of rich things that the Lord wants to tell us here. So keep reading, keep studying. Make sure to click like, make sure to share, subscribe, make sure you're ready to see our other videos, get the word out to other people. But I'm Eric. Until next time, keep your lamps trimmed and burning.